Harold is, of course, chairman of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation, which is the official successor of the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, which he chaired with Senator Dick Durbin and Representative, now Secretary Ray LaHood, for 9 years. He's the author, co-author, or editor of 42 books on Lincoln and the Civil War era. Among them, The Lincoln Image, The Confederate Image, The Lincoln-Douglas Debates, Lincoln as I Knew Him, Dear Mr. Lincoln, Letters to the President, My Eyes Have Seen the Glory, The Civil War in Art, The Lincoln Family Album, Lincoln on Democracy, co-edited with Mario Cuomo and published in 4 languages now, and Lincoln at Hoover Union, a speech that made Abraham Lincoln president, which won a second-place Lincoln Prize. Harold has won Research Writing and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Illinois State Historical Society, the Manuscript Society, the Victorian Society, the Civil War Roundtables of New York and Chicago, the Lincoln Groups of New York, Peekskill, and Washington. In 2008, he was awarded the National Endowment Medal by the President of the United States. He has also written 500 articles over the past 35 years in both scholarly and popular publications, and contributed chapters and prefaces to some 30 additional volumes. In addition to writing, Harold lectures across the nation. One of his programs, Lincoln Seen and Heard, with actor Sam Waterston, has been staged and broadcast from such venues as the White House, the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, the Clinton Presidential Library, the Library of Congress, and Ford's Theater. Their recent program, Lincoln in American Memory, was televised by PBS on Bill Moyer's Journal. Holzer has also appeared frequently on C-SPAN, History Channel, and served as an on-air commentator for such Lincoln bicentennial specials as Looking for Lincoln and Stealing Lincoln's Body, and on PBS, National Geographic Network, NBC, and the BBC. So, without further ado, Harold Holzer.
Thank you, John. I think you did every bit as brilliantly as Sam Waterston did. I have no recollection of what he said, so especially sterling in my mind. And thank you, Karen and all your colleagues for organizing this conference, and congratulations on the turnout on this beautiful Saturday morning. Mark is a tough act to follow, but I thought of a transitional sentence that would flow from one subject to another while he was concluding his remarks. That is that while he spoke about a fascinating subject that he described as arcane, because we don't have military draft anymore, I'm going to speak about an issue that is quite resonant in our culture. And that's the subject also in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. So even as we wonder whether, last month it was about whether WikiLeaks has unlimited rights to publish whatever secrets or files it gets hold of. Certainly more currently, does Google have a right or an obligation under what it says today is a cease and desist or clear and present danger obligations to take down obnoxious videos that are inciting violence in the Muslim world? Interesting questions that continue to resonate. On the subject of freedom of the press and the Civil War, we have a fascinating set of questions and circumstances. And again, as Frank will tell you when he does his habeas corpus discussion next, and of course I based part of my introduction on the fact that Frank would have already spoken, and I could key off that as well, but we know, of course, that Lincoln used executive power to determine that he alone could suspend the privileges of the writ of habeas corpus while Congress wasn't in session. And we know that Lincoln did call Congress back into session for a symbolic meeting on July 4th, 1861. But while he used the time between Sumter and the special session to crack down on civil liberties in some circumstances, what I found astonishing in the research I've done on the press, a subject I'm plowing into now for a book on the whole culture of the press during the Lincoln era, from his earliest days in politics until the end of the war. I find it fascinating that the first major abrogations of freedom of the press took place after Congress returned, and after Congress would have in its memory and in its sense of duty the Bill of Rights protection about freedom of the press. During the secession crisis, during the run-up to Sumter, and even in the days after Sumter, with the call for volunteers, with the blockade, we don't see much agitation about the press venting on both sides of these issues from a Democratic and Republican point of view. They're engaged in old-fashioned ping-ponging debate on the editorial pages, rather than a censorious debate, objecting to the right to express opinions. And what happens next is, frankly, rather staggering. At least it has been for me. Statistically, about 300 recorded separate incidents, and I'm still counting, that included, in the next 4 years, not all directed by Abraham Lincoln, of course, banning newspapers from the U.S. mails, interrupting and controlling the flow of telegraphic news, arresting and imprisoning editors, closing and ransacking newspaper offices, seizing and destroying equipment, dragging them through the streets. Everyone loves to drag printing presses through the streets and then throw them into the river. That wasn't a Civil War era phenomenon. It happened multiple times. And generally suspending publication. Many of these actions occurred where the union held control and courts still functioned. One incident took place in that rebellious state of Maine, for example. Now, in areas loyal to the Confederacy or teetering between northern and southern control, or occupied by the Union Army or military governors, we can add the following to the litany. Participating in or failing to prevent mob attacks against newspaper offices, sometimes army attacks against newspapers. And this happened on both sides, but I'm going to concentrate on the Lincoln side. Official censorship of battlefield reports and interference with war correspondence. The banishment of some, the humiliating punishment of others in public. And I think historians have not quite made the full audit, but I'm not sure I'm going to get close. With where Lincoln is concerned, we've tended rather to focus on a few landmark cases, which are often viewed in where Lincoln is concerned as mistakes he later corrected or remedied. Most Lincoln scholars have assessed the curtailment of press liberty as surprisingly infrequent and usually justified. And I'm going to suggest that the effort was actually more widespread, though it did remain disorganized and ad hoc for the most part. And one can argue in some cases justifiable in the crisis that Lincoln faced. I'm also going to propose that repression, as far as I can tell, was actually supported not only by most of the loyal Union public. That won't be too surprising, because freedom of the press, like lawyers, not a particularly popular group or ethos. So if you take a vote today on WikiLeaks or Google, you know what the result is going to be on a poll. Supported also by many newspaper editors, sometimes beyond politics, after the war gets underway. And then I'll note immediately that when Lincoln had the chance, perhaps, to apply total press censorship, a sedition move like Adams's or Wilson's, Lincoln did not do that. As we go through the period from 61 to 64, I think it's important to keep in mind what the culture of the press was. It wasn't the press of the year 2012. It was a political party press. The press was an organized part of political parties. It's the way Mark said it in a publication he wrote years ago that I've had the opportunity to look at again, the Extra Journal publication, which when I tried to flatter Mark and tell him I was using it, and he said, "I don't have a copy, I'd like yours." this for myself. Really useful. It was a culture of partisanship and political alignment by newspapers and newspaper editors. And it was also a period, long before the war, where slavery began inciting passions of violence. Famously in 1837, a mob in Alton, Illinois, tossed an abolitionist newspaper's printing press onto the ground and then kicked the pieces into the Mississippi River. And when the editor, Elijah Lovejoy, objected, he was shot and killed. A murder that roused a young Illinois leader named Abraham Lincoln to speak out against what he called the monocratic spirit and to suggest that reverence for the laws should become the political religion of the nation. But it didn't. Divisions over slavery heated up instead, and newspaper rhetoric fed the flames. So by the 1850s, when Lincoln rose to prominence nationally, most American cities boasted two newspapers, one Republican and one Democratic, each publishing increasingly inflammatory warnings about abolitionist plots on one extreme and on the other Southern plots to make slavery national and perpetual. Now Lincoln, whatever his comments in the wake of the Lovejoy murder, was not above this sphere. He was immersed in it. He was one of many politicians who not only befriended sympathetic editors, ghost wrote for them, hung out in newspaper offices, had his speeches printed by the newspaper so he could read them more easily, and had them agree to keep them secret until the update was agreed upon. But he was a politician who regarded opposition newspapers, as he put it once, as villainous reporters. Party malice, he said, and not public good possessed them entirely. Lincoln was not alone in these beliefs. Democrats expressed the very same thoughts about Republican editors. And these loyalties were fueled not only by shared political philosophy, which created these connections, but by the expectation of reward. Once in office, politicians repaid loyal editors with coveted jobs. Even before that, they paid them with important legal advertising that kept them going. They commissioned newspapers to create extra publications for political campaigns, which were rather lucrative. And this included honest aid, who repaid loyal editors with foreign consulates, postmasterships, and other patronage funds once he became president. The intertwining of press and politics was not a new or particularly objectionable phenomenon in 1861. In fact, it had become part of tradition. And keep in mind one more thing before we begin with press suppression. 19th century politicians did not merely reward or punish publishers. Politicians often were publishers. Publishers often were politicians. 3 members of Lincoln's first cabinet had been newspaper editors. The Speaker of the House had owned a paper in Indiana. In New York, Albany publisher Thurlow Weed was also boss of the state Republican Party. And it's because of Weed, I might mention on this as we near the 150th anniversary of the preliminary proclamation, it's because of Weed that New York State owns Lincoln's handwritten copy of the original proclamation. When Thurlow Weed's son-in-law asks you to donate your handwritten copy, you have to say yes. Newspaper men were friends of the president. The Tribune's Horace Greeley doubled for a time as a Republican congressman and had aspirations for the United States Senate. The New York Times was founded by the Speaker of the New York State Assembly. That always gets a big laugh in New York because the Speaker of the Assembly is constantly under investigation by the New York Times. In fact, we had a book party for a book called The New York Times Complete Civil War, and a collection I did for the Times, and I mentioned at the party the newspaper was founded by the Speaker of the State Assembly. That would be like Arthur, the publisher, was standing in the corner, being the Speaker of the Assembly right then. And he said, the party's over. So, it's a little sensitive today. The most anti-Lincoln newspaper in New York, the most racist newspaper in New York, was the Daily News, in relation to the current paper of the same name. If Lincoln became president, it warned in one particularly vile article in 1860, "We shall find Negroes among us thicker than blackberries, swarming everywhere." editor was the brother of the mayor of New York, who was plotting to take the city out of the Union so it could maintain profitable commercial ties with the seceded states. Press competition and outspokenness, of course, intensified exponentially with secession and civil war. Before his inaugural, Lincoln insisted that freedom of the press, as he put it, was necessary to free government. But in the secession spring of '61, this traumatic period when the survival of free government itself hung in the balance, traditional opponents became outright enemies when criticism was seen by many as treason. Lincoln concluded that he must save the whole Constitution, even if it meant temporarily sacrificing specific constitutional guarantees. And one of the first institutions to feel the effect was the press. But again, remarkably, not immediately, the New York Daily News was not censured or censored between April 1861 and July 1861. The watershed is Bull Run, as if the surprise, the shock of Union defeat, and the recognition that the war would not be a brief one, it inspires the Lincoln administration to recalibrate its attitude toward the press. And it's not just the Lincoln administration. It's not a top-down culture change. It's almost a bottom-up culture change. I'll give you one example. The aforementioned publisher of the New York Times, Henry Raymond. He decides that he wants to cover this first action in Virginia himself. He's really no better at this. Not a reporter. He's a politician and a businessman. He writes some good editorials. He's a good writer. But he decides he's going to go out to the field himself, and maybe there'll be a battle, and boy, he's on the spot. He's on the spot at Bull Run. And after a few hours, he hands a dispatch that's ridden into town on horseback into Washington. Glorious victory by the ragged rebel army turned back. And then Raymond's very satisfied with himself because the New York Times is going to get a big scoop. And then he gets back in the afternoon, and guess what happened? The Confederates do rather better in the afternoon than they did earlier. And of course, the Union Army and all of those witnesses that had been on hand to see the triumph are overrun. So Raymond this time goes to Washington personally, and he gives a new dispatch. Maybe, God willing, he can stop the presses and get the correct report out. And he sends a new dispatch. Terrible disaster at Bull Run. Union forces routed after early triumphs. And he hands it to the telegraph operator. And the telegraph operator looks at it and says, I don't think this is a really good idea for you to do. And Raymond says, pardon me? He says, well, it's so depressing, and it's so against the spirit of the Union. I'm not saying. Raymond has to go back on the train to New York, and not for 2 days do readers of the New York Times realize that the first report was inaccurate. And that's the first big act of censorship from the bottom up. By the way, William Howard Russell, another Times correspondent, this time from the London Times, writes very critically of Union resolve, Union courage, officer skill at the Battle of Bull Run. He never again enjoys the full rights of a foreign correspondent. And he's a famous war correspondent. He's been in the Crimea. Stanton afterwards makes his life miserable. He finally goes back to England. He just can't get to the places he wants to go to because he's had the nerve to criticize. More things happen after this. First, the Union bans the use of the mails and commercial exports with the rebel states, assumes full control. Well, they say they have full control of a vast telegraph system. They use it for military use. And the control of export products includes news. One of the first test cases involves a Philadelphia publication called The Christian Observer, whose tenuous religious affiliation did not mask its pro-secession and pro-slavery bias. A month after Bull Run, the paper published what it claimed to be an authentic letter from an anonymous Virginian, charging that Union forces on the march there before Bull Run had been guilty of, and I quote, gross, brutal, fiendish, demonic outrages meant to ravage the country, pillage the houses, and burn them, outrage the women, and shoot down children for amusement. Does it sound a bit like the Google film? The paper wasn't about to talk its home state of Pennsylvania into the Confederacy, but it did count many subscribers in Maryland and Delaware. And Maryland remained the only route for Northern volunteers to reach Washington, where Massachusetts troops had already been attacked. On August 22nd, federal troops invaded the offices of the Christian Observer in Philadelphia, confiscated the type, and evicted its staff. The editor appealed unsuccessfully to Lincoln that he was merely a poor old man who always promoted harmony and the preservation of the Union. But he fled to Richmond, ultimately, getting no relief from Lincoln about his business and his materials, and he reestablished the paper in friendlier climes. Lincoln never replied to the editor's insistence that freedom of the press, I have always believed, was one of the great bulwarks of our national safety. Because at this point, Lincoln was coming to the belief that the national safety, a phrase that he used from time to time, required journals like the Christian Observer to be put out of business. Around the same time, a grand jury in New York's Southern District sent a presentment to the courts asking whether certain newspapers here, again I quote, in the frequent practice of encouraging the rebels now in arms against the federal government, had overstepped freedom of the press and now deserve the employment of force to overcome them. The foreman of the grand jury identified the alleged sinners by name: the Journal of Commerce, the Daybook, the Freeman's Journal, and the Brooklyn Eagle, and our friend, the Daily News, which had recently editorialized, by the way, that if the government attempted to subvert state authority, every citizen was absolved by his sovereign from the social obligation to obey. Deciding that the presentment had the force of an indictment, the Postmaster General, Montgomery Blair, quickly banned all 5 newspapers from the U.S. mails. The Daily News tried to subvert the order by shipping copies not by the post, but by rail. So the government placed agents on board trains and confiscated them. Its subscribers cut off, the Daily News shut down, and its editor became a novelist, but that's another story. Facing similar ruin, the Brooklyn Eagle apologized in print and actually reformed its editorial policy. Unwilling to do either, the editor of the Freeman's Journal was arrested on the orders of the Secretary of State. He was in prison for 11 weeks. However extreme these actions seem to us today, they chilled few observers at the time. A grand jury in neighboring New Jersey read about the incidents and decided we should get in on this action too, so they named 5 disloyal papers of their own, and marshals in New Jersey shut them down too. That always gets a laugh in New York too, because New Jersey's always copying New York. That's another story as well. Mobs attacked pro-secession, or at least anti-war, anti-stop the rebellion papers in such non-Southern venues as Bridgeport and Dayton. Union soldiers from New Hampshire torched a paper in Bangor. That was the main story I told you about. Ugly incidents, all but directed at what people of the day regarded not as loyal opposition, not as expressions of freedom of the press, but as fifth-column anti-unionism. The War Department, meanwhile, contributed one order declaring that the public safety required the prohibition of all correspondence and communications, verbally, in print, or by telegraphing, respecting military movements on land and water, through which intelligence shall be directly or indirectly given to the enemy. This rather vague command placed 154 anti-newspapers on a kind of watch list. As early as April, telegraph wires, by then the standard medium for transmitting news, had fallen under full military control, or really later ratified by Congress, but of course typically run in a rather haphazard way, only 1 or 2 censors at a time, handling an amazing volume of material. By the way, in a little-known moment in his career, a Union general, who otherwise is sort of not regarded highly these days, and whose anniversary of his only important triumph is approaching on Monday, did what he did best, and it wasn't fighting, it was negotiating. George McClellan got 11 papers to voluntarily refrain from publishing any matter that may offer aid and comfort to the enemy. In return, McClellan offered facilities for obtaining and immediately transmitting all information suitable for publication. But he was a pretty good deal. I'm in command of the Army. If you sign this agreement that you're not going to say anything objectionable, you can have scoops about my heroic activities, and obviously you're going to make me a hero in these articles, so it was a good deal. But the ban stayed in place for outlasting McClellan, but it crumbled. In December 1862, for example, Union telegraph censors acting on that agreement forbade the Associated Press from mentioning that wounded soldiers staggering into Washington in huge numbers were arriving from a place called Fredericksburg, where there had been a major Union defeat. So the bureau chief ruefully observed, the rule was we must not let the enemy know what was taking place, as if the enemy did not already know that he had fought and won a battle. So the agreement crumbled. Many correspondents still sent messages and articles by mail. They would be dropped at the nearest town. And by and large, the press remained remarkably free to cover the war, perhaps more so than they are, in fact, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places like that. Descriptions and depictions of casualty, for example, were never forbidden. Only encouragement to rebel and later to resist conscription. If other newspapers felt a bond at first with their repressed brethren, they seldom expressed solidarity. Now, an argument can be made that they didn't want to go out on a limb for newspapers that were being closed down because they didn't want the same fate to befall them. But really, there was little danger that the New York Tribune or the New York Times were going to fall under that kind of suppression by saying, maybe you've gone a little too far with the Daily News or the Freeman's Journal. But they were pretty much out there on this issue of suppression. And by and large, they figured. The New York Times branded the Journal of Commerce guilty of exciting a riot in our streets and apologizing for the mob. No right of the press, Mr. Raymond insisted, this is the man who had been censored, should shield it from the penalty of a crime against society. The Chicago Tribune questioned the very concept of absolute freedom of the press, because in society, speech is always limited by the prevailing conditions. Until the war is over, it said, we must be content to accept whatever the altered condition of the times and the country may demand as a requisite of national salvation. Calling the Daily News that most pestilent of secession sheets, even the Democratic newspaper, the New York World, declared in 1861 that every newspaper that approved of secession should be regarded as the accomplice of treason. And Henry Raymond added that he was surprised that the administration has for so long forborne to defend itself against the fanatical and insurrectionary crusade of the secession papers published in the loyal states. Now, in states where no such loyalty reigned, Lincoln got 53% of the vote in New York, really only about 35% in New York City, but only 2% in Maryland, where rebel sympathizers cut the telegraph wires to Washington to isolate the capital. The press was more insurrectionary and, of course, more susceptible to repression, although New York had its share. Rejecting what he called extreme tenderness of the citizens' liberty, Lincoln had ordered the military, even before Bull Run, to arrest and detain, as we know, without ordinary process, such individuals as he might deem dangerous to the public safety, and this included the press. The Baltimore Exchange editorialized that the war of the South is a war of the people, supported by the people. Maybe that's what Lincoln got out of the people. While the war of the North was the war of a party carried out by political schemers. So military authorities shut down the paper, arrested editor Francis Scott Key Howard. Yes, he was grandson of the author of the national anthem, no less, and threw him into Fort Lafayette prison. Marshals quickly suppressed 4 of the city's other newspapers. Perhaps that's what Lincoln meant when he said all the laws but one to go unexecuted. So I've dwelled so far on the examples from 1861, not only because they're less known than later incidents, but because they set precedents for what followed. Had the country and other editors risen up to condemn arbitrary, sometimes arbitrary newspaper repression, it might have ended a warning. Now, I'm not ascribing blame to the victims here, but I do want to keep the context in mind so we can understand this phenomenon from the perspective of those who lived through it and not just through hindsight. Other branches of government did not interfere either. The Supreme Court remained silent. In early 1862, the House Judiciary Committee began hearings into the question of whether telegraphic censorship has been established, and if so, whether it can be used to restrain wholesome political criticism. And there's always the fear that this is a Republican press versus Democratic press effort, controversy, and effort by Republican editors to suppress Democratic editors and get more readers. The committee heard from many witnesses. The files are fascinating, including journalists who testified very frankly that they indeed feared using severe language as they put it against Lincoln. But the committee ultimately did conclude that legitimate political, personal, and general news had been inhibited, but recommended only that the telegraph be left as free from government interference as may be consistent with the necessities of a government in time of war. And that was ambiguous enough for the full House to take no action at all, no legislative remedy, and the censors were left in charge as they had been in the War Department without much further ado. In 1862, the administration added to the list of forbidden coverage anything to discourage volunteering. Later, of course, as I said, it included subscription. Yet an Indiana man no doubt spoke for many fathers when he complained of too little censorship. The people are getting tired of sending their sons to fight the rebels, he wrote Lincoln, while editors more mischievous by far than men armed with muskets are allowed to furnish aid and comfort to the enemy unmolested. That man believed that newspaper editors should be regarded as enemy soldiers. And then came a new issue, the Emancipation Proclamation. The New York Evening Express repudiated it in a scathing editorial. We do not know what liberty is allowed to free white men to discuss the proclamation freeing Negroes. We may be locked up in Fort Lafayette for all this free speech and free discussion, but we lend no sanction to any Negro equality. This tirade, this particular tirade, inspired one correspondent to ask the Secretary of State, how is rebellion to be crushed while such insulting, traitorous papers are allowed to be freely circulated among the people? Tens of thousands in New York, he continued, now stand ready to enter the printing establishments of several papers and break the heads of the editors, and are only restrained by its unlawfulness and are waiting for our weak government to do the needful to them. No action was taken here. The beginning of a slight thaw in censorship, ironically in the wake of Lincoln's most revolutionary initiative. There was not much, there was no censorship. Interesting, this is another interesting phenomenon that I'm looking into. No real censorship of the vilest criticism of the Emancipation Proclamation. In May 1863, this debate over press freedom came to a head in Dayton, Ohio, where Union General Ambrose Burnside arrested former congressman and newspaper editor Clement Vallandigham for speaking out against the draft, found guilty. I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Frank. But local newspapers who protested, like the Columbus, Ohio crisis, paid almost as heavy a price as Vallandigham, who arguably didn't pay a terribly heavy price, and became pretty famous. First, a mob tried to burn down the office. When editor Samuel Madary proposed nominating the exiled congressman for governor, a general banned crisis from the mails. Vallandigham's comeback ended in defeat, but Madary continued to be persecuted for what he called liberty of the press. He was arrested the following year for conspiracy against the Union. He died before he could face trial. He was not the only editor outraged by the case. New York held a mass meeting to protest the Langham case and the president's use of executive power. And Lincoln, in his famous reply to the Albany letter, defended his case against Langham and others who instigated protesters against conscription. Their sympathizers, he said, pervaded all departments of the government and nearly all communities of the people. Under cover of liberty of speech, liberty of the press, and habeas corpus, they hope to keep on foot amongst us a most efficient corps of spies, informers, suppliers, and aiders and abettors of their cause in 1,000 ways. It's not the most frequently quoted sentence from the Corning letter, but it's important because it was clear that in many cases Lincoln believed that disloyal editors were akin to spies and informers. It surprised few people at this time that the anti-war, anti-Republican Chicago Times also rebuked General Burnside over his initiatives in the Langham case. But the general surprised nearly everybody when he ordered the paper padlocked and its gun-toting editor, Wilbur Story, arrested for what he called the repeated expression of disloyal and incendiary statements. Now, this act of suppression Lincoln may have probably relished. The Chicago Times had been flaying him for years. But when people began marching in the streets of Chicago, protesting for the first time against suppression of the press, Lincoln became convinced that, as he put it, we should revoke or suspend the order. Both parties, by the way, were involved for the first time, as I found it, in the protests. Some interference still remained acceptable. By the way, in a less well-known aspect of Burnside's order, he also banned the New York World from circulating within his military department. The World had evolved into a rather virulent critic of Lincoln, so that part Lincoln did not overdo. But censorship by this time was commonplace within military lines. And here's an argument that's been going on ever since. What rights do the military have to, what rights do the press have to discuss military movements or military plans? And that is, of course, a subject of debate over responsibility and freedom that has gone on ever since. But some reporters faced courts martial over their reports, even though they were civilians. One was convicted and ordered to dig trenches for 60 days, with voluntary servitude. Another to ride a horse out of camp backwards, a sign across his chest that read, "Libel of the press." Reporters were routinely banished, menaced, and inhibited. Now Lincoln, by 63-64, is easing up a little. He tried revoking one decision to expel a New York Herald reporter from Grant's headquarters. Now, the New York Herald was the most widely read newspaper in the country, both by civilians and the military, by the way. And I don't think he wanted to offend James Gordon Bennett, the publisher of the Herald, if he could help it. But he was also unwilling to irritate his most valuable military asset. So he wrote, "If General Grant shall give his express consent, reverse the expulsion." Well, Grant didn't want to give in and he didn't want to be disobedient, so he said, "Why don't we let General Sherman decide?" That's like having the King Inquisitor decide on freedom of the press. General Sherman never met a journalist he didn't hate. And what he did is send the reporter a message. "Come with a sword or musket, prepare to share with us our fate in sunshine and storm, and I will welcome you. But come as the representative of the press, which you yourself say makes so slight a difference between truth and falsehood," and my answer is never. He never regained his credentials. William McKee, another suspicious Democrat editor, as Lincoln called him, a Democrat editor, had slightly better luck. McKee obtained and published a rather innocuous letter from Lincoln promoting General John Schofield to a higher rank, a command in Missouri. It's not a major transgression, it's more scoop than sedition. But Schofield demanded that McKee name his source. Who leaked this letter from President Lincoln? And McKee refused. So Schofield ordered him arrested. Lincoln gently reprimanded the general, not for violating freedom of the press, but for upsetting the political apple cart in Missouri. I fear this loses you the middle position I desired you to occupy, he said. I care very little for the publication of any letters I've written. Please spare me the trouble this is likely to bring. Schofield said, no, I'm not going to spare you the trouble. Not in so many words. So Lincoln wrote again. He said, well, yes, there's been an apparent impropriety, but it's still a case where no evil could result, and I am entirely willing to overlook it. It took 2 letters for Schofield to accede to his commander-in-chief's request and liberate editor McKee. As Lincoln had written Schofield in the letter that started the whole business, maybe this is what Schofield objected to, in the letter appointing Schofield. Let your military measures be strong enough to repel the invader and keep the peace, and not so strong as to unnecessarily harass and persecute the people. You will only arrest individuals and suppress newspapers when they are working palpable injury to the military in your charge, and in no other case will you interfere with the expression of opinion in any form or allow it to be interfered with violently by others. As with so many issues, Lincoln was evolving on this one, too. The most famous example of suppression was yet to come. In May 1864, it involved a number of newspapers in New York, including the New York World, which received, toward deadline, an official, they claimed, order from the president, announcing that he was going to order a huge new group of volunteers for the Army, 400,000 or 500,000. Most newspapers decided it was a fraud. The World decided to publish it. And Lincoln signed an order drafted by someone else, but he signed it, ordering General Dix to arrest and imprison in any fort the editors, proprietors, and publishers, to bring them to trial before a military commission for their offense, take possession by military force of the printing establishments, prevent any further publication. Why was this such a big deal? Well, the theory was that the conspirators who were involved in spreading the rumor of this untrue rumor of this call-up knew that it would depress gold prices the next day, and then the people involved in the plot would buy gold low. When the presidential order was proved to be a forgery, gold would bounce back to its pre-announcement prices, and these guys would make a killing on the gold market. And Lincoln wanted that stopped. Manton Marble of the New York World, one of Lincoln's most virulent critics, was put in prison. And he wrote one of those pamphlets that Mark likes to write about attacking the president and his order to arrest him. Joseph Howard, former Times reporter, also thrown into prison. I always look for these cases. Where would Lincoln have been happy about, really, truly happy, emotionally about the suppression of the newspaper? Joseph Howard was a real pain in his neck. Joseph Howard was so angry at being not told that Abraham Lincoln was leaving Harrisburg to go through Baltimore secretly. Howard had been with him every step of the inaugural journey, and I understand, as a one-time, briefly, a reporter, to wake up after sleeping in the hotel, and, okay, where are we leaving the train? Oh, the train left. You don't have a story to write anymore. So Howard wrote a story of his own, that the president was wearing a Scotch cap and a military cloak. And he started that whole assault against Lincoln's bravery and integrity that haunted him for years. So when they came to Lincoln and said, Joseph Howard is going to be thrown into prison, I wonder what his reaction was. It would be fun. By the way, at the urging of the governor of New York, a Democrat, General Dix was served with papers for forcible entry and incitement to riot. He was not indicted by the grand jury, but an effort was made. It does represent one case in which Lincoln himself believed the line had been crossed, separating press freedom and criminal treason. I want to end with one big caveat. As I said, Lincoln is evolving. The world case is sort of a bump in the road, a blip in this evolution of tolerance. Once the war is in full swing, emancipation, conscription. In 1864, the press, including the New York World, returned to business as usual in pre-war America, conducting one of the most virulent campaigns for the presidency. Remember, presidential candidates didn't conduct campaigns. They were conducted by surrogates and in the press. The New York World accused Lincoln of masterminding this secret plot to integrate society and promote intermarriage equality, the subservience of the white race, put out scurrilous and really racially vile campaign material. Lincoln never once moved to suppress the press during the 1864 campaign. It's a measure of his understanding that there was a line that he would not cross. And in that famous speech he makes after his victory, saying we could not have a free country without free elections, he really underlined it convincingly, and without a free press. Thank you. Yes, sir.
How effective was General Hooker's decree requiring bylines?
Requiring?
Bylines.
It wasn't very effective because bylines for war correspondents were generally pseudonyms. And pseudonyms, some of the reporters had 2 or 3 pseudonyms, depending on the mood of the morning. So it didn't have much of an effect. But it was an interesting ploy. Yes?
You mentioned at the end there about 1864 and not suppressing at all. But as, for instance, Tocqueville said in his travels, the press was important, if not crucial, to forming political institutions. So if there had been suppression for the first years of the war, wouldn't it have already created kind of a weakness for the Democrats in the 1864 election that would have at least weakened them, if not been cause for not press?
Well, remember, Mark was probably one of the first historians to point this out. Elections don't take place every 4 years. They don't even take place every 2 years in wartime America. It's hard to find a month during the Civil War when some kind of newsworthy election wasn't taking place. And when it came to raw politics, to politics unsullied by loyalty to the government, understanding of the requirements for volunteering and later conscription, the press was completely unfettered in political reporting, and they were a big part of marshalling turnout. And we heard an argument from Mark last night that turnout in 1862 in the inaugural election was largely kept high by among Democrats by a vigorous Democratic press and political organizations charging people to get out and vote, where maybe Republicans who are also complacent about the challenges to free press were rather complacent about the exercise of the franchise. But the political commentary was tolerated up to a point. I mean, you could oppose Abraham Lincoln. You could even get away with calling him tyrannical. You could not get away with saying that people should not fight for the Union or that the Confederacy was legitimate. And then, worst of all, that the Union should recognize the Confederacy as an independent country, forget about Europe. So, and again, there is no firm policy. There is no smoking gun. There is no credo that's written by Lincoln or Stanton or Blair or Seward. It says, okay, here are the rules. Here's what we're going to tolerate, except for the orders about the telegraph, which aren't effective anyway. I mean, General Lee writes that he decided on his troop movement through much of his 1863 invasion of Pennsylvania by reading the Philadelphia Press, which were brought to him, admittedly a couple of days late. He said, oh, the press says I'm moving here, I think I'll go there. Not very helpful, but that wasn't suppressed for the most part. So it's not an established system. Specific outrages provoke Hooker or Burnside or Stanton or Lincoln or captains of companies. One newspaper in the South which had fought against, argued against secession, is one of the first mob newspapers in the Confederacy. It's attacked by pro-secessionists. But this is the phenomenon. There's something adrenaline-provoking about breaking up newspaper presses and scattering type in the streets. You read it in every report. They threw the printing press out. They hit it with clubs. then threw them in the river, and they spilled the type out of the window. It was wonderful. New York, it's horrible. New York Illustrated News, I believe, wood engraving of the Union troops tarring and feathering and carrying on a rail a newspaper editor who had written unflatteringly about Union occupiers. I think it was in Missouri. Yes?
Do you think that because the Lincoln administration responded to these situations on an ad hoc basis, do you think that was done purposely so that it wouldn't raise to the level of a constitutional issue?
It's a good question. And I mean, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights says Congress shall make no law that will abridge freedom of the press. It doesn't say what the President of the Army can do on an ad hoc basis. But to assume that Lincoln and the administration intentionally decided not to put down write a bill of particulars against treasonous press is to assume that there was more than that there was a system. I think, again, my conclusion is that specific outrages and problems and threats alarmed the Lincoln administration or the military personnel. Some of it was out-and-out revenge and bad behavior by soldiers on the march. They took over Southern territory, particularly the so-called border state. They would act against the newspapers as surely as they would repress civilians. They'd throw out the editor and throw out the printing press if they couldn't replace the editor. But I think Lincoln himself and the administration is particularly concerned, I would have thought after secession, but between Bull Run and emancipation. That's when there are seem to be the most incidents that are not, purely acts of drinking too much or having a little too much adrenaline on the march. Yes, sir.
Am I right that there was no censorship of letters from soldiers or from generals, for that matter, and like McClellan's letter to his wife and so forth, criticizing Lincoln as the original guerrilla?
Stephen Sears, I think, is the only censor of McClellan's letters to his wife. Not a censor, but explicator. I don't believe so. But a newspaper person is a known quantity, and if you try to post in a military post office, I think they know who these folks are. But people got around it. They would hire local kids to run dispatches on horseback to the nearest town and then to send it off to an intermediary. Eastern readers were accustomed to hearing about Western battles late anyway because they had to go through the circuitous route to get the reports to New York or to Philadelphia or Boston. So another day probably didn't matter that much. And they did find ways around it. But generals like Sherman and Lee were really cracked down on newspaper reporters who telegraphed, in both senses of the word, their plans, because they removed the element of surprise. On the other hand, again, images of the dead. We're about to mark the 150th anniversary of the most important exhibition, art, in a way, photography exhibition of the entire Civil War in 1862, when Alexander Gardner's photographs for Matthew Brady were first exhibited in New York, showing the Antietam dead. Horrible, horrible photographs. For those who want to be reminded of that, might want to watch the Rick Burns documentary on Tuesday on PBS on American Experience. It's a televised adaptation of Drew Faust's This Republic of Suffering. I just saw a little bit of it on Wednesday. Boy, those photographs. I mean, it's one thing to see cartoon TV, but it's another thing to see them on a 70-inch television screen. This is the first time people had seen 30 corpses lined up with animals rooting at them and mouths agape. It's pretty horrible stuff. No censorship of that. That was tolerated. Casualty reports, which the government generally didn't distribute. The press was allowed to print the names of wounded soldiers. And the pictures were okay. Well, thank you all very much.